Hello, it's Matt. I hope you're having a good work week so far. I read recently an article by Ben Dunson at the American Reformer. He's doing a lot of good work over there. And this article was on eschatology and politics. And he said some things that I have thought about, and I've even said in personal conversations with people that I appreciated and thought this is something that should get a little bit more traction. Everyone has probably heard some form, it's certainly at least in our circles, everyone has heard the idea that your eschatology, that is your belief on what happens in the end, or what's called last things, will affect your political or your social involvement. And there's a trope that's often brought out for among those of us who are optimistic in our view of what will happen and the way God's kingdom will grow. And that trope is that everyone who doesn't hold to I'll summarize it and say a post-mill position, which I'll talk about that, why that is not exactly accurate, but those who don't hold to that view are basically inact. They have no reason to involve themselves in politics, in social matters. And even there are some who hold different millennial positions who say this. They say it doesn't matter what you do, and so on. The idea is that because we believe in a more positive, optimistic view that God's kingdom will continue to grow, then we have greater impetus to work. And rationally, that made sense to surmise that that would potentially be the case. But it doesn't, and Dunson points this out in the article, it doesn't hold up when you consider history, when you consider how people who hold different positions, how they actually work and how they participate in their society. So let's start out this way. The different positions in eschatology, there's three basic ones. And when we say eschatology, what we're really talking about is the millennial position. What is this 1,000 years that's referred to in Revelation chapter 20? Just the first few verses talk about the millennium. And there are three main views. The first view is the one I was raised in. It is premillennialism. And by the way, all these views are based on when Jesus returns. At what point in the millennium does he return? So a premillennial position says that Jesus will return before this 1,000 year reign starts. And then, of course, there's actually within premillennialism, there's several subset views, all based on, what happens with the Great Tribulation and so on, which I won't get into now. Many of us are most familiar with dispensational premillennialism, which whether you know that term or not, you've heard the term rapture before. Believe that there will be a rapture of the Christians, and then at some point before the millennium, Jesus comes physically and he reigns on earth for 1,000 years. Hence, pre-millennialism. He comes before the millennium. The other is called post-millennialism, and post-millennialism originally was the belief that Jesus will come at the end of a 1,000 year golden age of the faith. So you have history that just moves along, and the gospel will grow some, but then there will be a literal 1,000 years where Jesus will, well, I mean, where the gospel will grow, and then at the end of that 1,000 years, Jesus will return for the final resurrection after there is an apostasy at the very end. So that's, post mill, he comes post or he comes after the millennium. Now, both the premillennial position and the traditional post millennium position believes in a literal 1,000 years. So that reference to 1,000 years in Revelation 20 is exactly that. It's 1,000 years of 365 and a quarter days. But there's another position which has probably a longer pedigree in the history of church. I'm not saying it's exclusive, but it just there's a lot of history behind it. That's the amillennial position. So when you put the prefix a in front of a word, a negates the rest of the word. So when you see that something is, or someone is apolitical, that means that person is non-political. They don't participate in the political process. Well, amillennial is a belief that the 1,000 years is symbolic or it is figurative, because often in Scripture, when you see the word 1,000, it refers to a picture of time. For example, in Peter, in First Peter, Second Peter, chapter 3, he says that a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. That doesn't mean that there's a precise ratio of time where before the infinite God, one 24-hour day is the equivalent of our 1,000 years. No, it's a simple. Well, those who are amillennial believe the 1,000 years are symbolic for the age of the church from the time of Jesus' ascension to now, that we are living in this 1,000 year period. And there's different versions of this. Many who are amillennial believe that though the gospel, as it goes forth, many will be converted, but the world will get worse. There is also a more optimistic view that says there will be gradual growth in history. So, that's different versions of the amillennial position. Those are the three basic views: premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. And of course, I don't think I said, but of course, at the end of the amillennial position, the end for amillennials is when Jesus returns. So the similarities with all of these views, they all hold to a final resurrection where all the saints will be resurrected. They all hold to some sort of apostasy before the final resurrection. That apostasy is mentioned also in the book of Revelation, where Satan is unleashed. He deceives the nations for a time and then is overcome by the Lord and the army of his saints. So there are similarities, but within these views, there are people who take different different positions, but they're in their position, they like to say, well, your belief leads to this, or my belief leads to that. And of course, it's usually my belief leads to great and wonderful things, or my belief leads to me being faithful to Scripture, whereas your belief leads you to whatever terrible thing that may be. So for many who are post-millennial, they say that the premillennials or the amillennials their belief does not lead to participation in political, in politics and culture and the like. And there are some, and Duncan points this out, there are some who do say that, especially the most notorious in the amillennial view are those who are called radical two kingdom thinkers. The most famous probably is David Van Drunen in his book about God's two kingdoms, R. Scott Clark and others. If these names don't mean anything to you, no big deal. But they are very hesitant. Okay, not just hesitant, they are against the church displaying or speaking about cultural issues because they say that it can bring in a secular mindset into the church. Now, that's a whole other discussion, and this is not about uh, the view of the two kingdoms. By the way, that's only one subset of the two kingdom view. So I don't want you to get too wrapped too tight around that right now. But they are amillennial. So there are some who are in that view who say you shouldn't get involved, and also Dunson begins with talking about Pastor John MacArthur when he preached a sermon that he says, and I quote, "We don't win down here, we lose." And then he calls out postmillennials for thinking that they were going to take over the world. So, I mean, he ends in this paragraph by saying, "We're all going to be persecuted." So people hear that and they say, see, MacArthur is saying, absolutely, there's no chance, there's nothing we should do. But if you have paid attention recently to what's happened in the culture, John MacArthur and his church were one of the first significant churches, one of the first churches with enough members that it actually mattered in the state of California to open their doors when the People's Republic of California said, no, you can't. We're going to say all churches are unnecessary services, and we'd like you to remain closed, and preferably until 5 years after the earth dries up. So, because they did not do that, they received a lot of attention, and he was very clear in his stand that the government does not oversee the church. And he took a lot of flack for resisting, but they were faithful. Well, you can't say that they just gave over to whatever the government wanted in that, despite the fact that MacArthur is a free mill. He's a dispensational, premillennial teacher, has been ever since I can remember, and I mean all of his life. So for many, though, they think that the dispensational, premillennial view means that people have no reason to involve themselves. And I've heard that. I mean, I've heard people who blame that lack of cultural influence on their eschatology. But there wasn't someone recently, a friend pointed out a book that came out by Madison Trammell called Fundamentalist in the Public Square: Evolution, Alcohol, and Culture Wars After the Scopes Trial. And Dunson does a good job of summarizing. I don't even think he mentions this book. Like I said, I shared this article with a friend and he told me about the book. But in the book, Trammell talks about fundamentalist as 1920s and after culture wars. If you remember the Scopes trial, that's when the state of Tennessee passed a law against evolution, or saying you cannot teach evolution in public school. The ACLU volunteered for anyone to come in and violate the law because they wanted to go to court, that they wanted the trial to go public. And the city of Dayton, Tennessee was fine with that because they wanted publicity. So that happened. Well, then what happened after that, after the trial, which was Scopes he was found guilty, but then the verdict was tossed out based on technicality, and it didn't matter. The point is, they had this trial, and it was a show trial. It was, everybody got what they wanted, that they were able to express their view. And one view of history that was the received view until just within the last probably decade or so was this given by a man named Dr. George Marsden, called Fundamentalists in American Culture. I didn't check the name of that, but I think something like that. And Marsden says that the fundamentalists largely went into their own ghetto, that they only formed separate institutions, and that they did not proceed, or they did not try to have any effect in the public square. But Trammell, who does a lot of background information, a lot of background study in newspapers and the like, he sees that actually they did involve themselves in various parts of the culture war. It was the culture war that gave us prohibition laws, the laws against the buying and the production of alcohol. So that was pushed by fundamentalists. Now if that's not involvement in your culture, I don't know what is. Even though prohibition laws, the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment was removed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, you still had towns and counties across the South especially that didn't allow any, they kept, they were dry, that they maintained you cannot make or sell alcohol. Even until the late 90s, there were still many counties in Alabama, where I'm from, were dry, couldn't have alcohol there. So, but that's just one area. There was pushback against evolution, and he talked about other areas as well. And you can say, well, why would they fight those battles? Well, that's not a matter. The point is they were not quietists. They weren't just sitting inside their home reading their Bible and going over whatever the Toledoth who begat whom and keeping their religion quiet. They were taking it out in public. And Dunson talks about this, but I know that even in the last 30 years, many of you know the name Ronald Reagan. Well, Ronald Reagan would not have been elected president in 1980 if it were not for the strong, overwhelmingly premillennial religious. Dr. Gary North, who himself was a postmillennialist, talks about this in lectures that he delivered on, I think it's the Hidden History of the 20th Century. I mean, he was there when this happened, when you had a major shift. President Reagan spoke, well, at the time he was the governor of California. He spoke at a prayer breakfast that Jerry Falwell and I believe James Robinson both were, different backgrounds, but they were Baptist, premillennialists, and of course it was a huge gathering of conservative, Christian, libertarian-minded believers, and Ronald Reagan said, "You cannot endorse me, but I endorse you." And of course, I mean, the man was called the great communicator for a reason. Everyone loved it. But what many don't remember is that at that election, that's when the religious right fully shifted from being a Democrat leaning voting bloc. Remember who the president was at the time? Jimmy Carter, Baptist from Georgia. And he made it, Carter talked about that he was born again. So the religious right shifted from Democrat, and the shift had already started, but this was when it came into full bearing. They shifted from that to being Republican. And it was no small thing. And the religious right revolution continued for a long time. It led to the House and the Senate both going Republican in 1994. So all this to say, Dunson talks about it to a degree, but premillennialists, if it were not for premillennialists, we would not have the modern conservative movement as it is. The number of postmillennialists who were influential in 1960, you could count them on one hand with fingers left over. There just weren't many of them. And it was the marriage of a very active view that Christians should be active along with even their view that we should, and we're called to believe, we're called to honor God, even though the millennium is going to get, or even though the tribulation is going to come, we still have to do this. That would carry the Republican Party for quite a while. So that's the premillennial side. I'm not going to talk as much about the about the amillennial perspective, except I will say that the amillennial, their view that the world will become less Christian over time, has historically not stopped them from participating in society either. Dunson makes a point of saying, I mean, just one quote, there is no intrinsic reason, however, why one could not seek vigorously to cultivate earthly Christian institutions, while even ensuring that the institutional church does not deviate from its spiritual task of preaching the gospel, administering the sacraments, shepherding the sheep, and carrying out church discipline. So these things are all necessary. And whether you are amill, pre-mill, or post-mill, that has been the normal view. So let's go back. Just talking earlier, I said there was a significant number of our fathers in the faith who were amill. The most famous is Augustine himself. He believed that while the church would continue and that even to a degree it would grow, that the world itself would gradually get worse. Now, this does not mean he didn't have a place for Christian civilization coming up at times. He did, but it was mostly a view that says, I don't know what God is going to do, but I see that what the book of Revelation teaches,
And he explains his view largely from Revelation. But it wasn't just Augustine who held this view. This was the majority of the medieval Christians. They were amillennial, especially after the year 1000 AD. Years ago, I read a book about the year 1000 AD and all the unique cults and the like who believed that Jesus was coming in 1000 because it's been 1000 years. And then, of course, we know what happened. He didn't. But Augustine was talking about 1000 years being symbolic, pictured well before. But a lot of our Protestant reformers were amillennial as well. So John Calvin was an amillennial. Martin Luther. I mean, it's established Lutheran teaching. Lutherans are amillennial. Keep on going. You can talk about Martin Luther, talk about Thomas Cranmer. These men are that they were amillennial, yet they did not back down from challenging the authority of the established church and the established social norms of their time. When Luther resisted teachings and the activities of Rome in coercing the people, particularly the poor, into giving when they didn't have anything to give, he was doing something that was necessary. And his belief about how the millennium would play out was not something that pushed or stopped him. It was just what he needed to do. The people who built the, they had a long-term view of history, but they were still amillennial. As Dunson says at one point in his article, that it is Augustinian amillennialism built Christendom, no mean feat, end quote. We could name more who were like this. J.R.R. Tolkien, Roman Catholic, he amillennial, C.S. Lewis, and we could that the list is long. Now, the unique group who's not in Protestant Reformed history are the Puritans. Ian Murray's book, The Puritan Hope, talks a lot about this, and they're really good things that come from the view that the gospel is going to go forward. But the point here is merely to say, profiling what Dunson talks about, that amillennial Christians were extremely active in their society. So we shouldn't say that they just quietly uh, minded their own business and didn't get involved. And here, I think it's important to point out that beneath your view of the millennium, the really important thing that we're talking about is not what happens in the millennium. When you ask somebody their view, what you're getting to is their philosophy of history. Where is history going? If you believe history is just one bit of progress built on more progress, then I mean that's one view. If you believe that history is going down, well, that's another. But most people, if they're honest, you acknowledge that there are periods of, and not just in one. It's not just one for the world. It's some places are having great things are built, while other places it's terrible. Contrast the Aztec Empire at the same time just before Cortez arrived. Contrast the Aztecs with Spain. The Aztecs they were powerful. They were a hideously barbaric society. Spain, flawed, yes, they were pursuing Christian society. So that will change over time. You have times of, some continents, some nations are on the rise, others are falling. So your view of history is really what you're talking about in many cases when you talk about your view of the millennium. Now, so I need to actually also mention that very few people today who claim to be postmillennial are true postmillennialist in that they don't believe in a literal 1,000 year reign of Christ that will come at some point in the future. This was the belief of Jonathan Edwards. It was the belief of people like one of the most noted 20th century writer is Lorraine Bettner, Reformed layman who wrote multiple books on doctrine. One of them is on the millennium. So the people who espouse a positive or optimistic view, a postmillennial view, most of them, they're a combination of Amill in that they don't believe in a literal 1,000 years, but they do believe that the growth of the church will generally continue. But even there, if you're honest, you'll acknowledge that there's periods of strength and periods of decline. But in general, the gospel is going forward. Now, if your view of the millennium doesn't directly affect social involvement, what does? My answer would be the real view of eschatology, not your millennial view, but your actual eschatology. Now, what am I talking about here? Well, if you look in your confession, whether Westminster Confession, London Baptist Confession, any of the historic Protestant confessions, the eschatology section will not talk about the millennium, other than to perhaps acknowledge that it is a thing. But eschatology, when they talk about eschatology, the word just means last or last things. Eschatology is the, the teaching about death, the final judgment, and the resurrection. This is what determines how active you are on earth in pursuing what is good and what is right. The people who believe that God will judge us according to the life we live, and that is not in contrast with those who believe that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, okay? Not at all. Our salvation is all of Christ. Jesus says, also in Matthew 25, that final judgment, there will, it will be a judgment according to works. The things that we do matter. Revelation 14:13, blessed are those who die in the Lord from henceforth forevermore, for they rest from their labors and their works follow them. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, the Apostle Paul talks about our works being judged, whether they are wood, hay, and stubble, or gold, silver, and precious stones. The people who believe that God is real and that in the end we will stand before Him and give an account of our lives, the people that believe it matters what we do, whatever the field is, whatever area that you're in which you're gifted, the people who believe that we will answer to God, they pursue righteousness. They pursue justice. They do what God gives them to do because they believe that God will, in His time, make everything new. And that's the last area where all believers, whatever your millennial position is, all agree the day is coming when all things will be made new, when the new heavens and new earth will be fully realized. We will enjoy it with resurrected bodies. So, when you're thinking about other Christians, don't get wrapped up in their millennial position. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. But it doesn't matter nearly as much as their belief and your belief that God will one day judge us, that we will stand before Him and give an account of our works. So be patient. Take a long term of history. Work well in the time God gives you, here and now. And whether the results are great or whether they are small, trust your work to God.